In 1847, a Hudson's Bay Company trapper walked into a post on the North Saskatchewan River after spending 9 weeks alone in the bush. He had no flour left, no salt, no tea. He had survived on what the land gave him and what he knew how to take from it. When the factor asked him what he had been eating, the trapper listed 6 things. 5 of them are on this list. The 6th was something the factor asked him never to mention again. Number 20 on this list kept fur traders alive for 200 years across a continent that was trying to kill them. Number 11 was so effective that Arctic explorers packed it on expeditions to the North Pole. And number 1 is a food so powerful, so portable, and so perfectly designed for survival that it fueled every major journey across the Canadian wilderness for 3 centuries. And it was invented by the people who were here first. These 25 foods were not cooked in kitchens. They were made over open fires, on frozen rivers, in camps where the temperature was 40 below, and the nearest settlement was 100 miles of forest away. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 rugged survival foods Canadian trappers actually ate in the wild. Number 25. Spruce tip tea. When the scurvy came, and it always came in a long winter, the trappers who survived were the ones who knew about the trees. The bright green tips of spruce branches, picked in spring and steeped in boiling water, made a tea that contained 8 times the vitamin C of orange juice. Indigenous peoples had known this for thousands of years and taught it to the first Europeans who were smart enough to listen. A trapper who boiled spruce tips every morning could spend an entire winter in the bush without losing his teeth or his strength. The tea was sharp and resinous and tasted like the forest smelled after rain. It was not pleasant. It was medicine that did not know it was medicine. Number 24. Labrador tea, a low-growing plant found in bogs and spruce forests across the boreal shield, with leathery oval leaves and tiny white flowers. Indigenous peoples used it as medicine for colds, sore throats, and fatigue for centuries before the trappers arrived. The leaves were gathered, dried, and steeped in hot water. The tea had a minty, slightly citrus flavor, and it warmed you from the inside in a way that plain hot water never could. Trappers carried dried Labrador tea leaves in leather pouches, the way other men carried tobacco. In the deep bush, where no supply post existed for months at a time, this plant was the difference between a man who kept moving and a man who stopped. Number 23. Fried salt pork. A slab of salt cured pork belly, sliced thick and fried in its own fat over an open fire until the edges crisped and the center went tender and translucent. This was the standard breakfast, lunch, and dinner of every trapper, voyageur, and bushworker in the country for 200 years. The pork was preserved in brine and packed in barrels, and it kept for months without refrigeration. The fat it rendered was used to cook everything else. A man could carry a 10-pound slab of salt pork into the bush and live on it for weeks. The salt preserved the meat, the fat preserved the man. Number 22. Hardtack. Flour, water, and salt mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, and baked until it turned into something closer to stone than bread. Hardtack was the most durable food ever invented. It lasted years without spoiling. It could not be broken by hand. It had to be soaked in water, broth, or coffee before it could be chewed. Sailors called it sea biscuit. Soldiers called it worm castle. Trappers called it pilot bread. And they packed it into every kit they carried into the bush. A biscuit of hardtack dropped into a pot of boiling water or stew softened in 10 minutes and became edible and filling, and it weighed almost nothing when dry. Newfoundland fishermen still use a version of it to make fish and brewis. The recipe has not changed in 400 years because it does not need to. Number 21. Dried moose meat. Moose was the largest and most important game animal in the Canadian bush. A single moose provided 600 to 800 pounds of meat, enough to feed a trapper and his dogs through an entire winter. The meat was cut into thin strips and hung over a slow smoke fire for days until it dried hard and dark and shrank to a fraction of its original weight. Dried moose meat was light enough to carry on a sled or in a pack. It lasted for months without turning. You ate it as is, chewing it slowly like leather until your jaw ached, or you dropped it into a pot of boiling water and let it rehydrate into a stew that tasted like the forest it came from. A pound of dried moose was equivalent to 5 pounds of fresh meat. That ratio is why trappers survived. Number 20. Rubaboo. A voyageur stew made from pemmican broken into pieces and boiled in water with whatever else was available. Wild onions, dried berries, flour to thicken it, sometimes a handful of wild rice. The name came from a French corruption of a Cree word, and it was the standard one-pot meal of the fur trade for 2 centuries. The voyageurs who paddled the canoe routes from Montreal to the Rockies ate rubaboo every night, around a fire on the shore of whatever lake or river they had reached by dark. It was thick, greasy, and filling, and it provided enough calories to paddle 18 hours the next day. No restaurant will ever serve rubaboo. No cookbook will ever print the recipe. It existed only in the hands of men who ate it squatting on the ground with a wooden spoon and a tin cup. Number 19. Smoked fish. Whitefish, trout, pike, or whatever the river or lake offered, split down the belly, laid flat on a rack of green sticks over a low fire, and smoked for 2 to 3 days until the flesh turned golden and firm and the moisture was gone. Smoked fish was the currency of the northern bush. Indigenous families traded it. Trappers stockpiled it. Entire communities along the rivers of northern Ontario and Manitoba survived the winter on racks of smoked whitefish hung in the cold. A man who camped on a good fishing lake in the fall and smoked enough fish could survive until spring without ever pulling a trigger. Number 18. Beaver tail. Not a pastry. The actual tail of a beaver roasted over an open fire until the thick, scaly skin blistered and peeled away, revealing a layer of fat beneath that was rich and gelatinous and unlike any other meat in the forest. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy among indigenous peoples and the trappers who learned from them. The fat content was enormous, and in the deep cold of a northern winter, fat was survival. A man burning 5,000 calories a day hauling traps through waist-deep snow needed fat the way a fire needs fuel. Beaver tail provided it in a single sitting. The taste was somewhere between pork and fish, rich and oily, and it was the kind of food that you either learned to love or you did not survive long enough to have an opinion. Number 17. Bannock cooked on a stick. Flour, water, salt, and baking powder mixed into a rough dough, wound around a green stick, and held over a fire until the outside browned and the inside cooked through. This was the bread of the bush. No pan needed, no oven. Just a stick, a fire, and 5 minutes. Bannock predates the fur trade by centuries. Indigenous peoples across the country had been making it long before the Europeans arrived, and when the two cultures met in the bush, bannock was one of the first things they shared. A trapper who carried a bag of flour and a tin of baking powder could make bread anywhere there was wood to burn. That portability is what made bannock the most important baked food in Canadian wilderness history. First pattern break. Here's what the history books never tell you about the Canadian bush. The cold was not the enemy. The cold was manageable if you had fire and shelter and the right clothing. The real enemy was calories. A man working a trapline in January, snowshoeing through waist-deep snow, hauling a loaded toboggan, chopping firewood, skinning animals, and maintaining a camp burned between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day. If he did not eat enough, his body ate itself. First the fat, then the muscle, then the organs. A man who fell behind on calories in the bush did not get tired. He died. Every food on this list exists because it solved a single problem. How do you carry enough calories into a place where no food grows, no store exists, and the only thing between you and starvation is what you brought and what you can kill? Number 16. Wild rice. The Ojibwe, the Cree, and other indigenous nations harvested wild rice from the shallow lakes and rivers of Ontario and Manitoba for thousands of years before any European set foot on the continent. The rice was gathered by canoe in late summer, dried over a slow fire, and stored in birch bark containers. It was lighter than any other grain, and it kept indefinitely. A handful of wild rice boiled in water with a piece of dried meat or fish became a meal that tasted like the lake it came from, nutty and earthy and unlike anything that grows in a field. Trappers who traveled through Ojibwe territory learned to trade for wild rice because it was the most efficient carbohydrate they could carry. Number 15. Caribou jerky. Caribou meat was cut into thin strips and dried in the wind and sun or over a low smoke. The finished jerky was dark and hard, and it could be chewed for hours like leather. It was the primary protein of the northern bush, above the tree line where moose did not range, and where fish were not always available. Inuit and Northern Cree families dried caribou meat by the 100 pounds after the fall hunts, and it sustained them through winters that lasted 8 months. Trappers who worked the barrens learned to do the same, or they starved. A pound of caribou jerky contained enough protein to sustain a working man for a full day. It weighed almost nothing. It never spoiled. It was the perfect food for a place that forgave nothing. Number 14. Rendered bear fat. A black bear killed in the fall, when it was fattest before hibernation, yielded several gallons of rendered fat that was the most versatile substance in a trapper's kit. It was used for cooking, for preserving meat, for waterproofing leather, for treating cracked skin, and for fueling lamps. Bear fat spread on bannock replaced butter. Bear fat mixed with dried meat and berries became pemmican. Bear fat rubbed into boots kept the water out. A trapper who killed a bear in October had his supply of fat secured through the winter. The rendering process took a full day. The fat was cut into chunks, melted slowly over a low fire, strained through cloth, and stored in tins or bladders. It solidified into a white grease that was odorless and tasteless, and lasted months without turning rancid. Number 13. Boiled rabbit. Rabbit was the most common game in the Canadian bush, and the easiest to catch. A man who knew how to set a snare from a length of wire could catch a rabbit on most nights with minimal effort. The meat was lean, almost to a fault. A person who ate nothing but rabbit would eventually starve because the meat lacked the fat that the body needed to survive in cold weather. Trappers knew this. They called it rabbit starvation. The solution was to add fat from another source, rendered bear grease, salt pork dripping, or the marrow from bones. A rabbit boiled in a pot with whatever root vegetables could be found, and a spoonful of fat became a stew that kept a man going for another day. Number 12. Bone marrow. The long bones of a moose or caribou leg are cracked open and the marrow is scooped out. It was eaten raw in an emergency, or roasted over a fire until it bubbled and softened when time allowed. Prairie butter was what prairie people called it, and it was one of the most calorie-dense foods available in the wild. A single moose femur contained enough marrow to provide a day's worth of fat. The taste was rich and unctuous, and it spread on bannock or hardtack like warm butter. In the lean months, when the dried meat was running low and the snares came up empty, bone marrow was the emergency reserve that kept a man alive until the hunting improved. Number 11. Pemmican on Arctic expeditions. When British and Canadian explorers headed north toward the pole, they packed pemmican. When Ernest Shackleton sailed to Antarctica, he packed pemmican. When Robert Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole, he was eating pemmican. The reason was simple. No other food on Earth packed as many calories into as small a space with as long a shelf life. A brick of pemmican the size of a man's fist contained enough energy for a full day of hauling sleds across ice. It did not freeze in the cold because the fat content was too high. It did not spoil in the heat because the meat was fully dried. It was the food that made polar exploration possible, and it was invented by indigenous peoples on the Canadian prairies 1,000 years before any European thought to walk toward the ice. Second pattern break. Here is what most Canadians do not understand about the land they live on. This country was not settled by farmers. It was opened by trappers. The fur trade was the first economy of Canada. It built the trading posts that became cities. It carved the canoe routes that became highways. It drew the maps that became provinces. And the men who did that work, the voyageurs and the coureurs des bois and the Hudson's Bay Company trappers, and the indigenous guides who kept them alive, did it on the foods in this list: pemmican, bannock, dried meat, smoked fish, rendered fat, and tea made from trees. This country was built on a diet that most modern Canadians have never tasted. That is a strange kind of forgetting for a nation that owes its existence to the people who ate these foods and the land that produced them. Number 10. Rosehip tea. After the first frost, the bright red fruit of the wild rosebush, which grows across nearly every province, was gathered and dried or steeped fresh. A cup of rosehip tea contained more vitamin C than almost any cultivated fruit. It was sweet and tart, and it staved off scurvy and fatigue. Indigenous peoples used it as medicine. Trappers used it because it was everywhere. You could not walk through a clearing in the Canadian bush without stepping on rose bushes, and a man who knew what the fruit was worth would never pass them by. Number 9. Fried trout on the shore. Trout fried in salt pork fat. A freshly caught trout, gutted and laid flat in a pan with salt pork fat over a fire. 5 minutes per side. Eaten hot off the pan with bannock and tea. This was the best meal the bush had to offer, and every trapper knew it. The fish was pulled from water cold enough to kill a man and cooked within the hour. The flesh was firm and pink, and the fat from the pork crisped the skin, and the salt brought the flavor alive. A man who camped on a trout stream ate like a king. The rest of the time, he ate like a man trying to stay alive. Number 8. Dried blueberries. They were gathered in late summer and spread on hides or racks in the sun until they shriveled and darkened, and could be stored in bags for months. Dried blueberries were mixed into pemmican, stirred into bannock dough, dropped into stews, or eaten by the handful on the trail. They were one of the few sources of natural sugar and vitamins available in the bush after the first snow. Cree and Ojibwe families gathered them by the bushel, and they were traded up and down the canoe routes of the fur trade. A bag of dried blueberries weighed almost nothing, lasted all winter, and turned every meal it touched from survival into something that almost resembled pleasure. Number 7. Smoked eel. In the rivers of Quebec and eastern Ontario, eels were caught in weirs and traps in the fall as they migrated downstream. They were split, smoked over maple or alder wood, and stored in barrels. Smoked eel was rich and oily, packed with fat and calories. French-Canadian trappers and habitants carried it into the bush the way English trappers carried salt pork. The flesh peeled off the backbone in thick strips that were almost too rich to eat without bread to cut the oil. Eel was the forgotten protein of eastern Canada, and for 100 years, it was as common in the bush as beaver. Number 6. Sourdough bread from a starter carried in a pouch. In the Yukon during the Klondike Gold Rush, sourdough starters were kept alive through the winter by men who slept with them. The starter, a living culture of wild yeast and flour, was carried in a leather pouch or a tin close to the body so the cold would not kill it. In the morning, the trapper mixed it with flour and water, let it rise near the fire, and baked bread in a pan or a Dutch oven. The bread was dense and tangy, and it was the only leavened bread available in a territory that had no bakeries, no stores, and no yeast. A man who kept his starter alive had bread. A man who let it die had hardtack. The difference between those two things over a winter that lasted 7 months was the difference between enduring and breaking. Number 5. Moose nose soup. This sounds terrible. It tasted extraordinary. The nose of a moose, singed over a fire to remove the hair, was boiled for hours until the cartilage and fat softened into a gelatinous broth that was richer than anything a pot of bones could produce. Indigenous hunters considered it one of the finest parts of the animal. Trappers who learned this from their guides discovered a food that was almost entirely fat and collagen, the two things the body craved most in the cold. A single moose nose boiled into a soup could sustain a camp for 2 days. It was the kind of food that separated the men who understood the bush from the men who thought they did. Number 4. Rechaude. Pemmican sliced and fried in a pan with wild onions and potatoes, if you had them. The fur traders called it rechaude, and it was the hot version of pemmican, the meal you made when you had a fire and a pan and enough time to cook rather than chew. The fat in the pemmican melted and crisped the outside, while the dried meat softened, and the whole thing fried into a hash that tasted like the concentrated essence of every animal and berry that had gone into the original pemmican. Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police recorded in his journals that rechaude was one of 3 ways pemmican was eaten in the West, and it was the one the men preferred when they had the chance. Number 3. Bannock baked in ash. Not on a stick, not in a pan, in the ashes of a fire. The dough was shaped into a flat disc, wrapped in leaves or placed directly into the hot ashes at the edge of the fire, and left to bake. The outside formed a crust that was dusted with ash and charcoal. You brushed it off, broke the bannock open, and the inside was soft and steaming. Indigenous peoples had been baking bread in ash for millennia before the first European entered the forest. A trapper who watched them and learned the technique gained access to bread without carrying a pan. All he needed was flour and fire. Everything else was already on the ground. Number 2. Smoked salmon. On the rivers of British Columbia, the salmon runs were the single most important food event of the year. Indigenous nations along the Fraser, the Skeena, and the Columbia caught thousands of fish in weirs and nets and dried and smoked them over fires that burned for weeks. The smoked salmon was stored in cedar boxes, and it sustained entire communities through the winter. Trappers and traders who worked the Pacific coast learned to stock up during the runs because the smoked fish was the most nutritious and most portable food available west of the Rockies. A strip of smoked salmon eaten on the trail provided fat, protein, and salt in a single bite, and the taste of it, smoky and sweet and touched with the cedar it was stored in, was the taste of the Pacific coast before anything changed. Number 1. Pemmican. Dried meat, pounded to powder, mixed with rendered fat in equal parts, and packed with dried berries into rawhide bags. That is the recipe. 3 ingredients. No heat required for assembly. No preservation needed beyond the drying of the meat and the rendering of the fat. The shelf life was months. Some accounts say years. A piece the size of a date square contained enough calories for a meal. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company consumed 45 tons of pemmican a year during the height of the fur trade. Arctic explorers carried it to the pole. The Cree word for it, Pemmican, means rendered fat because fat was the ingredient that made it possible. Fat was the fuel. The dried meat was the structure. The berries were the gift that turned fuel into food. Pemmican was invented by indigenous peoples on the plains of what is now Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, and it is the most important food in the history of this country. Without it, the fur trade fails. Without the fur trade, the trading posts are never built. Without the posts, the railways have no destination. Without the railways, there is no Canada. Every time you look at a map of this country, you are looking at the roots that Pemmican made possible. That is not an exaggeration. That is history. And the fact that most Canadians have never tasted the food that built their nation is one of the strangest and saddest forgettings of all. Here is my challenge. Learn one of these. Just one. Make a batch of bannock on the stove. Steep spruce tips into tea. Dry a piece of meat over a low oven and see how it tastes. Then think about the men and women who did this not as a hobby, but as the only way to stay alive in a country that gave them nothing except what they were strong enough and smart enough to take. Share which one you want to try in the comments. I want to know if anyone has tasted pemmican. I want to know if anyone has brewed Labrador tea, because these are not just survival foods, they are the original Canadian diet. The one that existed before grocery stores and highways and heated kitchens. The one that built this country, one fire at a time, one meal at a time, in a wilderness that demanded everything and forgave nothing.